Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today we're doing an updated meta tier list for the Spacetime Smackdown format. So last Tuesday in the first week of Spacetime Smackdown, we did our initial meta tier list, and basically we kind of, did our best to assume what the best decks were at the metagame at that time. However, since then, a lot has changed. There's a lot of new decks that we're going to be including here on the tier list, and the decks and the ways that people are playing those decks have changed, as well as their viability in the current metagame. So before you comment below, why are you doing another tier list? Well, it's different. This one's updated, and this is much more accurate now. After a couple weeks, we have a much better understanding, I should say, of what the best decks are to play in the current metagame, and it changes from week to week. Realistically, a lot of changes have happened this past week since the first Ursa Days weekly tournament, and then now after the second one, and Exeggutor absolutely going crazy. So yeah, let's get right into it. This one's going to be a much quicker video, I promise. We've already talked about a lot of the new decks extensively, so we're not going to particularly spend too much time really going in depth on the deck lists. I'm just going to go ahead and give my impression on how good they are in the current metagame and maybe why I'm going to be putting them in their respective tiers. But everything on the tier list here is basically all of the most played decks in the format right now. If there's something that you don't see on this tier list that you think maybe should be included, comment below and let me know. But basically anything that has more than like a handful of people playing it at these large tournaments, I've included here on the tier list. There's a lot of decks in this format, but like I said, there might be some stuff on here that I'm not including. But again, if it's not on the tier list, it's just because nobody's really playing them in a competitive setting. So let's get right into it. So first and foremost, let's talk about our Articuno EX. So there's a couple different ways that people are playing Articuno, but I think overall, the way that most people are actually playing Articuno right now still is actually the 18 trainer version of Articuno. You can pair it with Palkia EX. We do have, I believe, many different Palkia decks on here, but Articuno, I would say the most popular way people are playing Articuno is just straight Articuno 18 trainers. It's actually still very, very good. All of the 18 trainer decks have exceptionally high win rates. Just the absolute overall flood of great trainer cards makes these 18 trainer card decks that much better. I do think that Articuno is still a good strategy. You can still get KO'd by a Blizzard turn 1. It's still very, very deadly in that sense. We have, you can run Sabrinas, you can run Cyruses, you can run Giant Capes and Rocky Helmets, all that good stuff. So it's a little bit of an RNG deck here. There's not a lot of strategy. It is a very linear playstyle, but I do think that it's actually still a good deck. Water in general is actually pretty good right now. There's not that much electric type going around. There are some Magnezone decks, but they're kind of seeing a decrease in play. And again, the potential to kind of pop off overall with Articuno is actually still really high. I'm going to comfortably put it in the A tier right now. Again, it has one of the highest average win rates in the entire format right now, almost 55%, and that is pretty significant. I know that it hasn't been one of the most popular decks, and it hasn't won that many tournaments, but the win rate and the overall consistency of the deck is much better now because all of the new trainers are much better. So we're going to go ahead and put it in the A tier. Next up, we have Aerodactyl and Lucario. So the thing with Aerodactyl and Lucario, much like all of the other, fighting decks, and we'll just kind of combine them all here, because there's quite a few to talk about. So the thing with the fighting decks right now is that Hitmonlee actually is really, really important, or it was rather this past week of competition. A lot of people were playing that Hitmonlee Marshadow package with things like Magnezone, or they were playing a more, frontline damaged deck, things with like Aerodactyl and Hitmonchan, or even predominantly those particular cards with Lucario. And I do think that in the format right now, which has changed a lot since the first week and now being a heavy Exeggutor format, I think that the fighting decks that don't invest super heavily into, the Hitmonlee Marshadow package, but have at least some, powerful attackers in the mid to late game, being boosted by Lucario is actually really good. I think that Aerodactyl is underrated in the format right now. It is weak to electric, which does make it a little bit tough. But again, if you're playing fighting type decks, we kind of want something to at least do significant damage to, an Exeggutor or a Celebi EX, which again are kind of the dominant grass type cards that you're going to be facing a lot in the mid to late game. So I actually really like Aerodactyl and Lucario as well. It does have a decent win rate. A lot of the fighting decks have, remained as a decent option at least. This is not the most played version of any fighting decks, but it does have about a 51-52% win rate in the format right now, but I believe it's probably going to trend up. Like I said, there's not a lot of Pokemon in this deck rather that are weak to grass, which is an upside. We still can have some front-loaded damage. I do like Aerodactyl, Lucario, and Hitmonchan as a combination right now, especially the way that the format is going. So I'm going to go ahead and put this again in the A tier. I think most of the fighting decks are really consistent. And if we talk about here, Magnezone and Marshadow, or Magnezone and Hitmonlee rather, just the sort of fighting type Magnezone combination. I actually think that last week it was a really great meta call. So far of the tournament, or of the format rather, this has been, I think, a top 10 most played deck because it was so significantly played last week. I think it's really good because it counters those Darkrai decks that play, you know, Druddigon, because you have Hitmonlee, but it also has a very, very good Gyarados matchup, almost an instant win matchup against Gyarados. We are going to struggle a little bit more with all of those grass-type Exeggutor decks that are kind of, you know, flooding the format right now. But at least we still have a decent water matchup against, you know, any Palkia decks or even Articunos and even Pachirisu, things like that. So I do really like this Magnezone fighting type deck. So again, I'm going to put it in the A tier. I'm going to actually put it above these other two decks. We're not really going to organize everything yet. We'll organize it quickly at the end. But again, I think that this is an anti-meta choice. It's probably going to become a little bit less relevant as an anti-meta pick because I think the format is shifting very heavily right now towards Exeggutor and these grass type decks, which, you know, we don't have as good of a matchup against, but I do think that it's still a strong contender. I think I'm leaning more towards some of these Lucario decks with maybe Rampardos or even Primeape and Aerodactyl more so than I am the Magnezone deck, but it has been doing really well in the last few weeks. Again, one of the highest win rates in the entire format right now, floating at around 54%, although I do think that's probably going to decline. And here we have Lucario and Rampardos, another A tier deck in my opinion. Again, a lot of these fighting decks are going to fall into A tier. I just think that they're consistent enough, but also powerful enough. These are all very different, but they all have very similar packages. I would say that the Aerodactyl version, a little bit more of a tempo-based fighting deck option. The Hitmonlee Marshadow package with Magnezone is a little bit more of an aggressive option while having a bit of a late game attacker in Magnezone. And then the Rampardos is more of a late game deck that really does focus around doing significant damage with Rampardos combined with Lucario. It can be pretty good. Again, it's a little bit weak in the early game, but the format right now is super, I guess it's like in between. Like there's not a ton of front loaded damage, but there's also not a lot of tempo or I guess setup decks. It's mostly kind of tempo focused. So I do actually really like Rampardos still in the format right now, again, because it has the potential to do a lot of damage. Yes, Rampardos in that line is weak to grass, I believe. Maybe it's weak to water, but I believe it's weak to grass. I could be wrong. Comment below and let me know if I'm wrong. But I think that being able to do significant damage in the late game is actually really good, at least the way that the format is going up. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in A tier as well. I am actually going to put Primeape and Lucario in the B tier. It hasn't seen nearly as much play as the other decks. It also has a little bit lower of a win rate, floating around 50% still, which I do think is good. I just think that 80 HP is a little bit it's a little bit on the lower side, and I think that there's just a lot of decks, things like Exeggutor can hit you turn 2, or even, yeah, turn 2 for, you know, 80 damage. So if we're not playing Giant Cape, or if we don't draw into those Giant Capes, that could be a little bit of a disadvantage, as well as I think other decks on turn 3 and turn 4 can just do 80 damage. 80 damage, or 80 HP rather, isn't a great number. Primeape is a consistent attacker, but I just think that there's enough Pokemon that are kind of hitting that threshold early in the game. So I don't necessarily love it, but it's not terrible still. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the B tier. And then next up we have Gallade decks. So Gallade is an interesting one. Again, if we're talking about more of a late game, you know, more significant attacking option for a fighting type, I think Gallade is fine. People still play it with Lucario, which is interesting. I think the problem with Gallade decks is that, again, if you're playing Gallade, you have to play 6 of those Pokemon in your deck because it's a stage 2 Pokemon. You kind of probably want to run Lucario, but again, that's more Pokemon you're adding to your deck. And then you need some sort of a lead-off option, so you probably would have to play things like Hitmonlee and whatnot. And you can technically attack on curve with Gallade, but Ralts and Curly aren't necessarily doing much damage anyway, so it's not significantly you know, something that we want, right? And there's just not a lot of Pokemon to kind of sit in the active spot when we're playing Gallade. So I think it's a little bit too slow, as well as Exeggutor having a lot of HP, hitting from early on in the game while also only having 1 energy and its attack cost makes Gallade just not a really great option, I don't think, at the metagame. I'm actually going to put Gallade in the C tier. I just think it hasn't seen enough play to really warrant being in any of the higher tiers, and the participation that Gallade has seen hasn't been great. Most of the Gallade decks are always floating below 50% win rate. So honestly, I would say C tier is a bit generous for Gallade. I know some people like it, but it just really isn't as good as the other fighting deck options. Okay, so next up, let's take a look at the grass decks, because this is really where I think the format is heading for right now. Basically, Exeggutor is the strongest card in the game, or at least one of them. The thing with Exeggutor is that it counters and hits for weakness on Darkrai EX. And this particular deck right here, which is just Celebi and Exeggutor without Jungle Totem, without any of the other bells and whistles, it's literally just like a 2-2 Exeggutor line with maybe 1 or 2 Celebis thrown in. And it's probably, in my mind, the best deck in the game right now. It has everything going for it. Not only are we hitting a lot of those decks for weakness, basically a lot of Pokemon, or a lot of these Dark-type Pokemon, are weak to grass. Darkrai is still one of the most common cards in the format, but here's the thing with Exeggutor and Celebi is that we have really, really strong options going both first and going second, and that is important, right? Because we want early game potential. Like, yes, if we're going first on our second turn, we can just start attacking with Exeggutor. That's always been really good, but even just starting with Celebi, and if we're going second especially, we can just attach to it and attack, and then attach and attack, and just do that. Stay alive for a long time. We have Giant Cape in the deck, we have Rocky Helmet too, but we're playing Erika's, we're playing Potion, so that strategy, using Celebi as just sort of a tempo-based attacker that just ramps up slowly, it really is just, it's a little bit more RNG dependent, but the whole deck is really, but it's just really, really annoying to deal with, and a lot of decks just don't have that kind of pace as well as staying power because Erika's is such a strong card. Yeah, Pokemon Communications makes it a little bit more, I guess, you know, consistent as well. I just think it's perfectly placed in the metagame right now, it's just so consistent and so powerful in so many different ways. I just don't think that there's a lot that this deck doesn't do properly. Because we're running so few Pokemon in this deck, we could run like 2 copies of Sabrina and 2 copies of Cyrus, which just makes the deck so much more consistent in that early game. Like, there's a lot of Druddigon decks floating around still, a lot of Darkrai decks, and just being able to Sabrina early in the game is so strong. Sabrina multiple times. You know, you can Sabrina, tag a Darkrai, it retreats back out again, you just bring it up with Cyrus again and KO it. The deck does exactly what it needs to do, and there's not a lot of counters to it in the format. Gyarados is a pretty good counter to Exeggutor EX, and I believe Charizard as well is a good counter. We're going to talk about those decks a little bit later, but for now, I believe that this deck, not only did it win, or it didn't win, it got second place this week at the Ursa Days tournament, but Exeggutor in general, just one of the best cards in the entire game, if not the best Pokemon in the entire game. So it's going in the S tier very comfortably. It's kind of floating around one of the highest win rates in the game right now as well. All of the Exeggutor decks are kind of sitting around 54% win rate, so very, very good. In my mind, this is the best way to play it at the moment. However, you could also play it with the Mew EX, and this is basically the same thing, but just a little bit different. Instead of playing just one Celebi and Exeggutor, we are also just playing one Mew EX. It does make the deck a little bit less consistent in the early game, but again, if there's a lot of Charizards running around, if there's a lot of Exeggutor running around, or not Exeggutor, a lot of Charizard or even Gyarados or Palkia decks running around, which probably will see a little bit more rise in play, basically because of the fall off of maybe these Magnezone decks because Exeggutor becoming more popular. I think that Mew EX is actually a pretty good inclusion. Again, it depends. Would you rather have a really significant attacking option to revenge KO things like Charizard or Gyarados, or would you maybe build your deck a little bit more consistently and focus around the early game? Either way, again, I still think this is an S tier deck. It technically has a higher win rate than this version of Celebi, even though it's not nearly as played. But either way, I think the 2 most significant Exeggutor focus decks are probably the best 2 decks in the format right now. We'll have to see if things counter them pretty heavily, but I just don't really know how we can counter them because I think all of these Darkrai decks, Electric, Magnezone decks are still going to be prominent enough that we can't really bank on just playing Charizard and playing Gyarados and hoping we just dominate because there's enough of those other decks to kind of counter you. But next up is going to be Celebi with Jungle Totem. This one's actually going to go in the B tier. I think Jungle Totem was the best way to play Celebi last format. Last format was very, very different for a variety of different reasons. Before Cyrus was in the game, we could just kind of rely on building up a Pokemon on the bench and just, you know, waiting until it was able to sweep through our opponent. We still play Exeggutor in a deck like this, but again, with Pokemon inclusions also being included, it doesn't make sense to run a ton of different Pokemon in your deck. It actually makes your deck less consistent. Now with Pokemon Communications, basically, Pokemon Communications is just another way to draw some of those evolution Pokemon or even basic Pokemon in your deck, but basically the less amount of Pokemon that we're playing in our deck, the more consistent Pokemon Communications is. We're still playing Research, we're still playing Pokeball. Right now what we're seeing in the format is the less Pokemon, the better, especially the less type of Pokemon, the better, and that's why I believe Jungle Totem not necessarily as good of a card. Also not as front-loaded or consistent in the early game, which is, again, what the format is also kind of leaning to. So we're going to go ahead and put Jungle Totem and Celebi in the B tier. I think it's grass. I think it's still fine. It could even warrant an A tier placement, but it just hasn't seen enough play. I don't really feel confident enough to put it that high on the tier list, so we're going to go ahead and put it in the B tier. I think you should much rather play the other Exeggutor decks as well. And here's another one, is Venusaur, and this is a kind of what I think a lot of people are actually moving away from, that late game Celebi Jungle Totem build, and just kind of playing Venusaur. If you wanted to play more of a late game, more powerful, you know, stage 2 Pokemon for a grass type deck, I think Venusaur is actually a pretty good strategy right now. You can just bypass a lot of the late game shenanigans that you would do by investing energies in Celebi, building up Jungle Totem. Now we can just play Venusaur EX and probably do really well in the late game. There's actually not a lot of things that can deal with Venusaur right now. Really, the only hard counter to Venusaur EX is Charizard EX, which hasn't seen that much play. And like I said, if we're playing things like Darkrai and we're playing things like Magnezone, or even some of these fighting decks with Lucario, being strong in the late game can be an advantage. So again, we're very much less consistent in the early game, but extremely, extremely powerful in the late game. And with Pokemon communications, again, getting into Venusaur is that much more consistent. Exeggutor with Giant Cape, with Erika's, with Potions can really carry you in the early game as well. So from a drawing perspective, it's less consistent. It hasn't seen enough play for me to really want to put it like much higher in the tier list. It doesn't have anything like super significant from a win rate perspective, so I'm going to go ahead and put Venusaur in the B tier, but again, it's grass type decks, and stage 2 Pokemon are just a little bit better, or stage 2 decks are a little bit better now with Pokemon communication, so we're going to go ahead and put it in the B tier. And next is Yanmega and Exeggutor, so very, very similar. I know we have 3 Exeggutor decks in S tier, but that's what the format is right now. Yanmega did win the last tournament, and that is a big reason why I'm putting it in the S tier. But the thing with Yanmega and Exeggutor is, again, it's very, very similar to the Celebi deck. However, we're running more Pokemon, so we have less opportunities, I should say, to play more trainer cards that could be useful. That's why I think I would rather play the Celebi deck right now, even though Yanmega did beat Celebi in the finals. The thing with Yanmega is, again, you're a little bit less consistent in your early game startup. You're a little bit more reliant on Exeggutor EX, but we have much more significant and, I guess, potent damage in the mid game with Yanmega EX. It's got more HP. We can rely on Giant Cape. We're doing 120, one-hit KOing Darkrai, so it's a little bit more consistent in the mid to late game from a damage perspective, but I still think that the early game pressure from Celebi might be a little bit better, even though in the mirror matchup, I guess Yanmega would probably be, or not mirror, but in the head-to-head matchup, Yanmega might outperform Celebi in that particular matchup. I think overall in the metagame, we would rather play the more consistent option, and I think the Celebi version of Exeggutor is maybe a little bit more consistent in the early game, but Yanmega is still extremely good. Again, it's still one of the most consistent attackers in the game right now. Again, it's not very useful early on, but we still have Exeggutor, we have Pokemon communication, so the deck isn't like any. It's still one of the more consistent decks in the game right now. Exeggutor is just that good. But yeah, we're gonna definitely still put it in the S tier. I think that these grass type decks, again, there's not much to counter. We didn't really see any new fire type Pokemon coming from Spacetime Smackdown. All we got was Infernape, which really has ended up being kind of a middling deck. It hasn't really necessarily been that significant. So anyway, Yanmega Exeggutor going in the S tier for sure. Let's speed this up just a little bit. We're kind of already about 15 minutes into the video. I said we would move quicker, and I promise we will, but here come the Darkrai decks. So Darkrai and Magnezone, I'm actually going to put all of these Darkrai decks in the A tier, because right now, yes, they are still some of the strongest decks in the format, but the way that the meta is shaping right now, they struggle pretty heavily against these Exeggutor decks, so I don't feel super comfortable putting them in the A tier. However, I would probably still put Darkrai and Greninja into the S tier, because I think it has enough of a balanced matchup even against the Exeggutor decks that I feel pretty confident putting it in the S tier. You can play it with Kangaskhan, you can get some early damage out, you can, set up your Darkrai, hopefully you draw into those Greninjas early on. Pokecom, Cyrus, Greninja, very, very good, makes for a very strong combination, and I think it pairs well with Darkrai EX. So yes, I think Darkrai is kind of falling down a little bit in play, but the Greninja variant has a much better matchup spread across the overall format. It's not as weak to grass, like I said. We don't have to necessarily utilize that Darkrai until we basically need to, so that's a pretty upside. Exeggutor as well is not one-shotting Darkrai EX, so again, as long as we're not reliant on it too early in the game, it's not that big of a problem. An early Sabrina and an early attacking Exeggutor can still be a problem for us for sure, but like I said, we can swap out Druddigon for Kangaskhan to be a little bit more consistent and proactive in the early game. But yeah, I think Darkrai and Greninja is honestly the best way to play it currently at the moment. The other decks are all still very, very good, but the way that the meta is forming right now, in fact, I might actually put Weezing in the B tier. I just don't think Weezing is that strong of a deck here. It always has a bit of a lower win rate than the other ones as well, and overall, I think Darkrai is going to go down. So let's put Darkrai and Weezing in the B tier, but Magnezone and Weavile, which are both very, very consistent decks. I know that the Weavile variant is, basically completely weak to grass, and that is going to be a downside, but it is still very potentially strong in the early game. It's very consistent, very explosive, so we're going to keep it in the A tier. But yeah, that's the Darkrai decks. I don't really have much else to say about them, if I'm being 100% honest with you. I think that they're all still really strong. It's just the way that the format's going right now, I would probably not choose to play Darkrai, at least right now in this current format. And if I did, I would choose to play the Greninja variant, like I said. Okay, let's take a look at the Dialga decks next. This is interesting. I actually think that Dialga struggled in the early game. Not a lot of people played, or in the early format, I should say. Dialga didn't see a ton of play in the first couple weeks, but I actually think it's kind of on the rise. The most common way to play Dialga is definitely going to be, if I just double check here, where are we? Where's Dialga? Yeah, it's definitely going to be Yanmega. Again, I still think a lot of people are going to be playing Darkrai, even though the format is shifting a little bit to an Exeggutor-based format. But, you know, Dialga doesn't have a terrible Exeggutor matchup in its own right. It's pretty tanky. We can play potions. We can play giant capes or even rocky helmets. We can survive for a pretty long time. We can do some chip damage to Exeggutor and then just go into a Yanmega and hit for 120, which again is pretty good. I still like Dialga EX and Yanmega with Mew EX as well. I think we're going to see another rise in Gyarados and Charizard, so I think Mew EX is still an important inclusion here. But I do like Dialga and Yanmega still. I'm going to put it in the A tier. I don't think it's like going to be super high A tier or even close to S tier, but I still think that it's a really good deck. Still floating at around a 52 to 53% win rate, which is much better than what we can say about the other Dialga decks, which I am actually going to both put them in the C tier. I guess you could maybe put Licky in the B tier, but overall, I just think Dialga's not super well positioned. We don't hit anything for weakness. Yes, we can be strong into the late game, but other decks are strong into the late game as well. They just have a little bit more early pressure and a little bit more early consistency. So Melmetal, again, a little bit underwhelming, but so is Licky. On paper, Licky is better, but the amount of play that it's seen and the amount of, I guess, success that it's seen has been limited. Both of these decks are below 50% win rate. Haven't really seen a lot of results, so I feel pretty comfortably just kind of putting them in the C tier. But if we are playing Dialga, Yanmega and Mew EX are significantly, I would say, the best way to play it. But yeah, overall, I actually do like Dialga. It's just, you got to be a little bit more specific on how you play it, but I think actually has the meta shifting. I think we have a decent Exeggutor matchup, at least overall. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and put it in the A tier, at least at the moment. Next up is going to be this Garchomp deck. So Garchomp has seen a little bit of fringe play. Its win rate isn't as bad as you would think it is. I think it's an overall pretty consistent deck. It's one of my favorite decks, at least, to play in the format right now, even though it's not necessarily meta. It's not something that's going to be really taking over the metagame to any degree, but it is, again, something that I enjoy playing, and I think that it's better than people give it credit for. I don't have a lot to say about it. I think that Manaphy decks in general can struggle a bit in this format with a lot of Exeggutors getting KO'd on your second turn. Does feel bad. If we're going first, that can be, again, pretty tough for us, but overall, I mean, I think that it's not a terrible list. Is it better than these things in C tier? Probably not. So we're probably going to have to put Garchomp in the C tier. I think it's just very middling. Again, we're not hitting anything for weakness, and 150 can be good, but again, it's conditional because we need Cynthia. So I don't hate Garchomp, but I don't love it. And again, it's just not as good as any of the other decks that I would put above it. So it's going to sit pretty comfortably, I think, in the C tier. And speaking of C tier, so is Infernape. So let's talk about the fire decks, Infernape and Charizard. So Infernape really isn't a bad deck. If we go ahead, I just want to go ahead and maybe see if I can find the win rate for Infernape. Yeah, so unfortunately, we're floating at around 46%, which just isn't good. Technically speaking, we do have a good Exeggutor matchup, so I might be more apt to put this in the B tier. But like I said, if we're still struggling against a lot of other things in the format, and I think there's still going to be a lot of water decks being played in the upcoming weeks, we're kind of just not doing what we need to do. Yes, the Dawn strategy can be good. The damage is pretty significant. 140 isn't bad, but Giant Cape Exeggutor, you still live in attack from, so that's something to keep in mind as well. And Exeggutor EX can kind of KO your Moltres on turn 3 or 4. So unless we're drawing into Infernape really early, then it's a little bit tough as well. So I don't know, maybe we put it in the B tier. I think it's really a C tier deck, but I think its position in the metagame is moving up. So we're going to go ahead and put it in the B tier, actually. I don't think it's as bad as its win rate shows. I think that the format is actually shaping up to make these fire decks, and Infernape specifically a little bit better. So let's go ahead and put Infernape in the B tier, but let's talk about Charizard, because I still feel strongly about Charizard EX. I know it's a little bit disrespectful. A lot of people don't necessarily love Charizard, and they've kind of been hating on it a little bit, but here's what you got to understand is that Charizard literally went like 10-0. It was the #1 seed after the first day of the Ursa Days tournament. It ended up winning the first 2 rounds of Top Cut before losing. There wasn't a ton of Charizard representation, but I don't think it really matters. The average win rate for Charizard is actually still around 49%, which isn't as high nearly as these other decks in S tier, but the average win rate for Charizard doesn't really matter because it's all about getting lucky, right? If you're one of those few players in a tournament playing Charizard and you happen to get really lucky, you're just going to end up dominating. There's nothing in the game that really counters you significantly. There's not a lot of Mew EX seeing play, and there's a lot more Exeggutor decks seeing play as well. So I really do like Charizard EX, even more so now than I did last week, and it did place, I think, in the top 4 of last week's tournament, and it placed, I believe, in top 16 or top 32 of this week. It's still a really strong deck. It's kind of versatile. It's weird. It's very volatile in that sense. Like I want to put it in the S tier because I do think it's still a strong pick. Do I think it's as good as the other cards or decks in S tier? Probably not. But it's too strong and it's too consistently high placing in so many different scenarios for me to want to put it in the A tier. So I feel pretty good, honestly, putting it low S tier. I think it still has to stay S tier because it's just that good. And that's just my opinion. Next up is going to be the Lake Trio deck, and unfortunately, it has seen a little bit of play, but it's always struggled very, very heavily. I just think it's missing a little bit of key like combo pieces in these particular decks. I think that the overall strategy is just a little bit too awkward. I think the interaction of needing both Uxie and Azelf on your bench to do the 160 with Mesprit makes it a little bit tough because you probably also want to play Gardevoir to make sure that we're getting those energies on Mesprit a little bit more actively. But 3 energies to attack and then discarding those energies means we can't really attack turn after turn no matter what. And like I said, it takes a little bit longer to set it up. We only have 70 HP on all these Pokemon. There's too many Exeggutors running around, too many Darkrai decks running around. So I just can't in good faith put this anywhere other than D tier. I think that it possibly could be strong. It just didn't get enough support, or maybe if Mesprit had 2 energies in its attack cost, it would be much, much better. But unfortunately, it just can't carry with the rest of the decks in the format right now. It is fun, it is niche, but again, Psychic is tough right now in the format as well. 70 HP is just a really bad number. And like I said, we're not fast-paced enough to really warrant anything significant. So we're going to put it in the D tier. That's a little bit unfortunate, but it is kind of the truth. I wish it was better, but it really isn't. Let's take a look at the other Psychic decks. So Mewtwo as well. I think we're probably going to have to put Mewtwo just kind of in the D tier. It has still seen some play, which is actually pretty funny. It's still the 9th most played deck in the format. I think people are still Mewtwo players. They're still believers. It's also, people maybe just don't have that many cards, but they do have Mewtwo built out, so they're kind of still on the boat here on Mewtwo. But it's a really, really tough pick in the metagame right now. 150 just isn't nearly as good as it was, and we're not fast enough. So if we're not one-hit KOing Pokemon with Mewtwo when we attack, it's just not really worth it because, again, it's difficult in its own right to attack turn after turn. It requires some setup, and we only have a 150 HP in our own right, so it's just not likely with the pace of the format right now with Exeggutors and even some of these fighting decks and Darkrai decks. It's just really not well placed. So unfortunately, we have to put Mewtwo in the D tier. Again, I think that if the format was a little bit different, or if Mewtwo had gotten maybe some additional support cards, it could be better. But it's actually funny to me that as honestly a top 10 most played deck, the sample size is quite large. 840 wins to 1,300 losses is just really tough for Mewtwo. Literally a 40% win rate. One of the lowest out of any of the decks here on this tier list, so it has to go into the D tier for me, which is actually really, really crazy. Next up is going to be Luxray and Electivire. And Luxray in itself is actually a really good card. It's better than I would ever expect it to be. This deck isn't terrible. It actually has a 47% win rate. I think Electric type, again, is just the best type in the game right now, and hitting or sniping the bench is still pretty good right now. It allows us to bypass needing to use things like Cyrus, which can be good. Overall, I think the deck doesn't have like super good pace, and none of our Pokemon have a ton of HP, but we are running single price Pokemon, so it has enough going for it that I think it's actually pretty decent, at least in the metagame right now. But with Exeggutor floating around, basically doing 120 to a bench Pokemon just isn't enough. Even though it does have pretty good matchups in various aspects of the format, there's still quite a bit of water going around. Luxray and Electivire just isn't a great deck. It has seen some play. Like I said, it's got a 47% win rate. It's won a total of 130 matches, so it's actually a pretty decent deck, and some people are choosing to play it. As far as single prize archetypes go, I don't think it's honestly that bad. So we're going to go ahead and put it in the C tier. Next up is going to be Bullfrog. So this is actually still an archetype that people are playing. I think that Mew EX is actually better now than it ever was before. I still think that, even though it does struggle a little bit against Exeggutor, it's not particularly useful in those scenarios. There is still enough Gyarados flooding around. There's enough Charizard flowing around. enough Palkia flowing around, that this deck actually has remained one of the most consistent win rate decks in the format. So I actually feel pretty good about Mew EX and Greninja, like just the Bullfrog archetype. Still I think one of the more consistent matchup-based decks in the game. Not a lot of people are playing it. It hasn't seen a lot of results, but it is, I think, from a win rate perspective and a consistency standpoint, actually better than the other decks in C and D tier. So I'm just going to go ahead and put it in the B tier. Again, most people aren't choosing to play this archetype anymore, at least with all of the new cards, but it is still pretty decent, so we're going to go ahead and just put it in the B tier. Next up is actually Mismagius. So Mismagius is really interesting. It's actually seen quite a bit of success recently at some smaller tournaments. It actually placed extremely well at a couple events this week after the Ursa Days tournament as I record this. And I'm actually pleasantly surprised by Mismagius. There's a lot of different ways that you can pair with it. I'll put probably one example up here on the screen. You can play it with Sigilyph or Mew EX or even Magnezone. Again, you can pair Magnezone with Mismagius. It's not bad. It really isn't as bad as I honestly expected it to be. Because it's a stage 1 Pokemon and had 2 energies and its attack cost, I really kind of wrote this Pokemon off. Again, it only had 140 HP, but it is still a lot better than, again, I honestly thought it would be. It's just consistent, I think that, 70 damage isn't that bad. You're 2-hit KOing a lot of Pokemon in the game. Again, the status conditions, no one's playing Lumberry in their deck, so status condition, it's not going to be taking over the format, but it's actually a lot better than I thought it would be, especially in the last couple weeks. It's doing pretty good. So as far as Psychic decks go, it's actually much better than the other 2 Psychic decks that we have on the tier list. So I'm actually going to put it in the B tier. I don't think it's actually that terrible. In fact, I would actually rather play some of these Mismagius decks than really anything here in the C tier, which is kind of crazy, if we're being honest with you. But again, it has a better win rate, at least in the last week. So definitely really, really interesting. So next up is going to be Pachirisu, and as it turns out, the way that we're playing Pachirisu, similar to Articuno, is going to be the 18 trainer decks. And Pachirisu, in my mind, is a little bit less of a high roll deck compared to the Articuno 18 trainer deck, but it's much more consistent. There's nothing else I can really say about Pachirisu, but 80 damage every turn from your second turn onward is just really strong. Again, we can play multiple Sabrinas, multiple Cyruses, we can play Giant Capes, we can play basically any trainer card in the game, and there's a lot of good trainer cards, especially doing 80 damage. Electro-type, the best type in the game right now. It's actually a lot better than you would think it is from a win rate perspective. We're actually floating around 55%. You gotta let that sink in. Playing literally just Pachirisu and 18 trainers gives you a 55% average win rate. It hasn't won anything yet. It's, I think, not in the top 10 of the most played decks, so unfortunately, it just necessarily hasn't gotten a big chance to shine, but honestly, from a pure viability perspective, it's literally one of the most consistently winning decks in the game right now. So we have to put it in the A tier, similar to Articuno. These decks just have win rates, even though they're not the most played decks in the game, they have really good win rates. So we have to just put them in the A tier, because I honestly think from an overall strength perspective, that's how good these decks are. Next up is going to be Palkia and Vaporeon. So it's been seeing a little bit of a decline. I put it, I think, in the S tier last week, and then it kind of fell down a little bit with all of the massive inclusions of Magnezone. But here's the thing with Palkia and Vaporeon, is that it doesn't care. It's going in the S tier. People disrespect this deck. It's just good enough. It's just plain old strong enough to where it doesn't matter. Honestly, it's kind of similar to Mewtwo, like I said last format, where, maybe it's well positioned in the format, maybe it's not, but it's consistently going to be placing around or winning around 52 to 53% of its matches. I think it actually has a pretty good Exeggutor matchup as well, so that makes me kind of like it a little bit more. We're going to see a decline, like I said, of the Darkrai and Magnezone decks. We're probably going to see a decline of Magnezone decks overall. And like I said, I think we do pretty good in general against these Exeggutor decks. I'm not exactly sure what the win rate is. I guess I can just check really quickly here because I just have it kind of pulled up. The win rates here against Exeggutor is all above 50%. So yeah, I think Palkia is trending upwards. I really do think so. Again, it's good enough to where I think early in the format, people were really countering it. Again, in the Ursa Days tournament, Darkrai and Magnezone was the most played deck to counter, I believe, all of these new water type decks. But I think that now things are really shifting towards Exeggutor. This really does open up the room for a lot of these water decks, whether it's Palkia EX and Vaporeon and Manaphy, or it's Gyarados EX, which has always been one of the strongest decks in the game. So we're going to go ahead and put Palkia in the S tier, and I really do feel strongly about that. I think it's one of the better water decks in the game right now. In fact, I do think it's better than Gyarados, which I am going to put into the A tier. So this is interesting to me. I was actually originally planning to put Gyarados in the S tier. It did win the first week of the Ursa Days tournaments, and it does consistently do well against Exeggutor, which, like I said, is probably going to be the predominantly most played deck for the upcoming week or next few weeks. So you would think that Gyarados might be an S tier pick, and honestly, I kind of do want to put it in the S tier. I just don't think it's performed as well as we would otherwise expect. The thing with Gyarados is that it struggles. Like, it struggles because we've seen an influx of Hitmonlee decks, and we've seen an influx of these Magnezone decks, specifically the combination of Hitmonlee and Magnezone. It was one of the most played decks last week. It will probably still remain as one of the most played decks. It really depends. Like, if the format shifts to where it's almost entirely focused around Exeggutor, then I think Gyarados is a good inclusion. But if a lot of people are still playing Magnezone and Hitmonlee, I think Gyarados is just going to struggle. It just auto loses to a lot of those Hitmonlee decks, and it does just feel kind of bad. It's been the 4th most played deck of this format. Unfortunately, below a 50% win rate over the last 2 weeks, but I think things are going to trend up for Gyarados. Not enough for me to want to put it in the S tier, which is why I'm going to put it at the top of A tier. I'm probably going to eat my words. It's probably going to win this week's Ursa Days tournament, but I don't think it's necessarily as good as it could be. I think that the format right now, there's just too many really hard counters to Gyarados, and I think people still have Gyarados in their minds. So we're going to put it in the A tier, top of A tier at least at the moment, but we'll see how things go. And then similarly, at the bottom of A tier, I'm going to put Palkia and Greninja because I still think Palkia is strong. But again, if we're playing the Greninja, Druddigon, or Kangaskhan combination with a Water-type Pokemon, I think I would rather play Gyarados. We do eliminate our Hitmonlee weakness, right? We're not getting one-hit KO'd. Our Magikarps are not getting blown up by Hitmonlee. Makes the deck a little bit more consistent from like a matchup perspective, but overall, late game power, I think we would rather play the other Palkia variant to just overload energies onto Palkia and just attack turn after turn. So I mean, I guess I put it at the bottom of A tier, but I don't think it's bottom A tier. I think it's just A tier. We'll reorganize it here at the end. We're almost done with the video, but I do think that it's still a strong pick. I think Palkia is just so good. And like I said, I think water is actually on the up right now. It's been heavily countered early on, but I think things are changing away from it. Grass seeing more play. Really going to open up the space for water type decks in general. Let's take a look at Starmie deck. Starmie and Palkia, again, I think is probably still A tier as well. It has a very consistent win rate overall. It's been a little bit lower than the other water type decks, so maybe B tier, maybe A tier. It's hard. It's really tough for me to say. I think it's pretty fringe. I don't think it's nearly as good, or I don't think it's as good as really any of these other water decks that we've put above it personally. I like Starmie, but again, we don't have that strong of a matchup against other tempo-based decks, things like Exeggutor, even Darkrai. Still a lot of Magnezone, I assume, running around. Pachirisu is still a card as well. I just don't think that we're doing that good in the format right now. Even Moltres is weak to electric and not water. So being a tempo water deck isn't necessarily that strong. I think if we're playing water-based decks, we would probably just really want to focus around Palkia or Gyarados, and if not, I think Articuno is probably the next best option. So I am actually going to put Starmie and Palkia in the B tier. I just don't like it as much as the other water decks. So the win rate on it is also less high. It's about a 48% win rate in the first 2 weeks. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put it in the B tier. Next up is Pikachu and Zebstrika, which is going to go into the C tier. I almost put it in the D tier, but no, it's still good enough. Again, we still have decent Gyarados matchups. It's still strong against water-type decks. The unfortunate thing with it is it had a really bad matchup. Do we put it in the D tier? It's tough. Pikachu has fallen off very significantly. Again, I just don't think it's advantageous to run a lot of Pokemon in your deck, and Pikachu relies on having a lot of Pokemon in your deck. In last formats, it made Pikachu more consistent, but the thing is now we have Pokemon communication, so it's actually better to run less Pokemon in our deck, which means that we don't really want to play Pikachu because, we need to run a lot of Pokemon in our deck with Pikachu, which means we can't play all of those great trainer cards like Rocky Helmets and Cyruses and Sabrinas, things like that. There's less room in the deck, so Pikachu and Zebstrika, it really has fallen off pretty significantly, so I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going to put it in the C tier. It's funny because it actually has like a worse win rate, I think, overall than Luxray, or it's very similar. So we're gonna put them both in the C tier. Again, I just don't think it's nearly as good enough as these other B tier decks from a win rate perspective, but also a position in the format. And then next up is going to be the Skarmory decks that I'm leaving for last. Skarmory is actually my favorite card from Space Time Smackdown. I think that it's extremely good. I think that it pairs really well either with Bastiodon and Magnezone. In fact, Skarmory decks have some of the highest win rates out of any decks in the entire format right now. I think no matter how you're playing Skarmory, it's going to be consistent. I think that the Magnezone Skarmory deck over the first 2 weeks, this deck here, over the first 2 weeks of the format actually has a higher win rate than any other deck over the first 2 weeks, about a 58% win rate. That's how consistent this deck is, which is why I kind of would put it in the S tier, but I can't put it in the S tier for a couple of reasons. One, it's not nearly the most played deck in the format right now. Unfortunately, it's not even like a top 20 or top 15 most played deck. Yeah, both Skarmory decks are just outside the top 20 in terms of how commonly they're played, even though their win rates are exceptionally high. So they don't have the results to really back it up, even though their win rates are significant. The other thing to note is that Exeggutor is, it is arriving. So It can feel bad. The cool thing though is that Skarmory actually has a decent early game matchup against Exeggutor, like I said, because Execute only has 50 HP. So if if Exeggutor is going first and you go second, and you just hit that Execute in the active spot for 50 damage, you actually just KO it, and it's really, really funny, but it's a lot more consistent than you might think. Both of these Skarmory decks are going to go into the A tier. I would love to put Magnezone and Skarmory in the S tier. In fact, I might just do it because it's my favorite deck to play right now. Do I do it? I mean, I feel like we need at least wide Magnezone representation in the S tier, don't we? Yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm actually going to do it. It's a little bit ill-advised. It's either A or S tier, but in my mind, it's still my favorite deck in the game right now. So I feel pretty comfortably putting it in the S tier because, again, the win rate is just so good. It's just so consistent. It's just one of my favorite decks to play right now. So this is more of a personal choice here than it is a then I guess maybe a statistical based position. At least I don't think it's going to be S tier maybe in this upcoming week. Well, I mean, we'll have to see. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, the win rate shows for itself. So I do like Skarmory decks, both of them. Bastiodon, it's a little bit more consistent in the early game, but just less strong in the late game. And I think Metal, like I said, isn't a great offensive type, so we would rather have maybe something a little bit more significant. I think as a mid to late game attacker, Magnezone is just much, much better than Bastiodon. So for that reason, we're going to go ahead and just put it a little bit lower in the A tier, but still has a very high win rate in its own right. I guess we could organize this, but doesn't really matter if we organize this, to be 100% honest with you, because like I think all of the decks in their respective tiers are very, very like similar, and I think their win rates are very similar as well. Like if I had to really organize the A tier here, I would probably do it like this. I would put Magnezone up here. I would move like Darkrai Magnezone as well. Darkrai Weavile I would put like here below the fighting decks. Dialga I would actually move up probably right up about here. Pachirisu, move up a little bit. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to spend too much time organizing this, honestly. I'm probably just going to end the video here. We're about 40 minutes, so it's just still a little bit longer than I wanted, so I do apologize. But I will put timestamps. I know some of you guys were complaining about how long the videos are, and I do apologize, but that's just kind of what we do on the channel. We just talk a lot, and I try to include timestamps to make things a little bit easier to navigate my videos. So for that reason, it is what it is. But yeah, two and a half weeks into Spacetime Smackdown, and this is kind of what in my mind rather, and for my opinion, what the meta looks like, at least right now, and what decks you should be playing. Exeggutor extremely strong. All of these other decks in S tier that aren't Exeggutor, in my mind, are just the other best decks in the format. But anything in A tier can pop off and win. They just don't see enough play or have high enough win rates, rather. I guess you could kind of say that Darkrai Magnezone could be in the S tier, but I don't know. I don't think it's as good as we originally thought it and it does struggle with Exeggutor, which again is on the rise heavily. So yeah, I mean, that's the tier list. That's the tier list this week, guys. Here's the thing, is that I actually made this tier list template a public template. So if you go to the link down below, you can actually build your own tier list and use this template. You can kind of link me on Discord or on Twitter and show me how you did your tier lists, or you can just comment below and let me know what you would have done differently, what you would have changed about this tier list. But like I said, this is for right now in the current metagame, and I feel pretty confidently in this list. Honestly, we'll have to see this coming weekend when the next Ursa Days tournament comes out, what the results look like and how the meta formulates. But in my mind, if we're going into this weekend's competitions, I would go ahead and play these S tier decks maybe a little bit more prominently than things like the A, B, or C tier. So anyway, guys, that's going to be it. Peace out. Have a good one. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. We're almost at 10,000 subscribers. So yeah, anyway, guys, I'm going to get out of here. Have a good one. Peace out. We'll see you guys next time. And yeah, bye.